A few days after Thanksgiving 2020, so that's more than 8 months into the pandemic shutdown, a COVID skeptic doctor with more than 250,000 followers tweeted the following: "Our churches must reopen. We need to pray at this time of year. It is the holiest time in the Judeo Christian calendar." That might have been an indication that the term Judeo Christian had outlived its usefulness. Of course, there is no such thing as a Judeo Christian calendar, and the holiest time in the Jewish calendar is not in December. But Judeo Christianity as a term is alive, if not altogether well. For example, this past September, the Department of Education proposed a new grant program that would prioritize patriotic education, naming Judeo Christianity as part of the American political tradition. It does not define the term, so let me try to. The prefix Judeo first appeared in the 19th century among scholars identifying hybrid concepts like Judeo-Arabic language or Judeo-Polish culture. Judeo-Christians, as a term in that era, described early followers of Jesus who observed Jewish laws and rituals, rejecting the Apostle Paul's efforts to welcome Gentiles into the Jesus movement. Had a very specific definition. But Judeo-Christian became a political term in the 1930s and 40s, when rising fascism at home and abroad spurred interfaith groups of Jews and Christians to use it as a name for their common cause of fighting anti-Semitism. And during the Cold War, it became a polemic term against the Soviets, the Judeo-Christian West versus the godless East. In 1952, President-elect Eisenhower used the term when speaking to reporters after meeting with the Soviet defense minister. Here's what he said: "Our form of government has no sense unless it is founded in a deeply felt religious faith, and I don't care what it is. Of course, ours is the Judeo-Christian concept, but it must be a religion with all men being created equal." Now, I like Ike for trying to articulate a unifying American civic religion, especially one rooted in full equality. But his use of Judeo-Christian and its prevalence today among religious and civic leaders suggests a dangerous kind of religious establishment, where the government favors one religion over others. This kind of established religion is not what our traditions, Jewish and American, had in mind. This Shabbat, I invite us to learn from two pairs of midwives, one from each tradition, who teach us a better way to balance religion and civil society. The first pair of midwives appear in this week's Torah portion, Shemot, as we begin the book of Exodus. The new Pharaoh, who did not know Joseph, stoked fear among the Egyptians that the Israelites were the enemy within, numerous enough to rise up against the Egyptians. But Pharaoh's first campaign against the Israelites, which was persecution by forced labor, stalled when it only made the Israelites multiply faster. So Pharaoh ordered the midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, to kill every male child born among the Hebrew women. Shiphrah and Puah famously dissented. Why? The Torah says it was because they feared God, that they disobeyed an evil order from a king of flesh and blood. I admit I had always assumed Shiphrah and Puah were Hebrew women. After all, the Torah says Pharaoh spoke la meyaldot ha'ivriot, which pretty clearly on the surface seems to say to the Hebrew midwives. But there is a tradition going back 2,000 years that reads this phrase as those midwifing to the Hebrew women, and therefore identifies Shiphrah and Puah as Egyptian women. Why does this matter? The sages who hold this view argue, I think persuasively, that calling the midwives God-fearing is more interesting and indeed only makes sense if they're Egyptian, not Hebrew. One commentator even asks, if the midwives were Hebrews, why bother to mention that they were God-fearing? Surely they would have acted to save their own people. Rather, the Torah praises these Egyptian midwives for what's called in Hebrew yirat Elohim, their fear of God, or better, maybe for our ears, awe and reverence. The Torah wants to remind us of our obligations as human beings. As Torah scholar Nechama Leibowitz puts it, neither moral courage nor sheer wickedness are ethnically or nationally determined. That's the lesson of this first pair of midwives. Fearing God is not about believing a certain dogma, but rather about taking action for our common humanity, which transcends faith, race, and nation. The second pair of midwives helped give birth to religious freedom in America, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Side note, on the gendered aspect of calling them midwives, if that's confusing, first, men could be midwives too, some of the roles of midwives anyway, and B, there's a long tradition of understanding the Exodus as the people Israel's rebirth and Moses as their midwife, starting with his complaint in the book of Numbers that God had asked him to carry this people in his bosom as a nurse carries an infant. So that's my side note, end of side note. I want to focus our attention on Jefferson and Madison's activities in Virginia in the mid-1780s, before the Constitution and First Amendment were ratified. During that period, a number of states had official religions, which both of these two men thought was a terrible idea. In 1784, Jefferson wrote against religious establishment in his Notes on Virginia. He said, "Millions of innocent men, women, and children since the introduction of Christianity have been burnt, tortured, fined, and imprisoned. Yet we have not advanced 1 inch towards uniformity." Jefferson knew that the old world was littered with casualties of religious coercion, and that one of these casualties was the integrity of religion itself. He praised reason and persuasion instead, calling on his young nation to leave the chaos of state-sponsored religion behind, in favor of a spirit of free inquiry and religious pluralism. On Christmas Eve, 1784, Virginia Governor Patrick Henry introduced, quote, "a bill establishing a provision for teachers of the Christian religion," end quote, which would create a tax to support Christian teachers and preachers. To justify itself, the bill said Christianity was necessary for preserving the peace of society. James Madison would have none of that. He drew up a petition in 1785 against the bill. In it, he reminded his fellow Virginians that the legal establishment of Christianity had been on trial for 15 centuries. The verdict, not great in his view. And I quote, "Pride and indolence in the clergy, ignorance in the laity, in both superstition, bigotry, and persecution." How's that for patriotic education? We should be reading more of this in schools. Madison also reminded his fellow Christians that a state with the power to establish Christianity at the exclusion of others could just as easily establish a particular sect of Christianity to the exclusion of all other Christian sects. He called the bill a departure from America's unique offering of asylum to the persecuted and oppressed of every nation and religion. And he even went so far as to liken it to the Inquisition, saying it differed only in degree. Madison's petition and others like it garnered enough support to defeat the bill. And a half-decade later, building on Jefferson's Virginia religious freedom law, Madison led the charge to enshrine these principles in the First Amendment. Madison and Jefferson won that battle, but their principles can't defend themselves. Today, there are too many cultural, religious, and political figures circling the wagons of Judeo Christian civilization, whatever that means, calling us to defend and establish it against an onslaught of what they perceive as enemies within, whether that's secularists or Muslims, or even Jews and Christians they disagree with, or some perceived other. So let us learn from these midwives. Madison and Jefferson insisted that neither Christianity nor any single religion is necessary for the functioning of our civil society. Instead, let reason and free inquiry flourish, and with them 1,000 expressions of faith. Shifra and Pua insisted that our common humanity transcends religion, race, and nation. Let no earthly authority blind us to this universal truth of Torah. May it be God's will. Shabbat Shalom.